Some of the world's oldest structures still don't make sense. Not because they are mysterious, but because nothing about their time explains how they were built so well, so carefully, and in such difficult places. Many of these sites were created without machines, without engineering textbooks, and without written plans. Yet they have survived for thousands of years. In deserts, on mountains, beside oceans, and deep in valleys, they are still standing. In this documentary, we look at these places one by one, not to exaggerate them, but to understand how ordinary people, with limited tools, managed to create structures that outlasted entire civilizations. Nuraghe Palmavera, Sardinia. Nuraghe Palmavera stands quietly on a low plateau near the coast of northwestern Sardinia, surrounded by olive trees, open fields, and distant views of the Mediterranean, and at first glance it does not appear dramatic or overwhelming. Yet the longer one remains here, the more difficult it becomes to ignore the confidence embedded in its stones. This structure belongs to a wider tradition unique to Sardinia, the Nuraghe, thousands of stone towers built during the Bronze Age, between roughly 1800 and 1000 BCE, and among them, Palmavera represents one of the most complete and carefully preserved examples, offering rare insight into how these monuments functioned within everyday life. Unlike isolated towers standing alone on hillsides, Nuraghe Palmavera developed as a complex, growing over time rather than emerging fully formed, with a central tower surrounded by secondary towers, walls, courtyards, and living spaces, creating a compact yet layered settlement organized around stone and proximity. The central tower, built from large limestone blocks stacked without mortar, rises in a tapered form, narrowing as it ascends, and this design is not merely aesthetic, but structural, allowing weight to be distributed downward while maintaining stability over centuries. Entering the tower, one passes through a low doorway into a circular chamber, where stone walls curve inward and upward, forming a corbelled dome that closes overhead without the use of keystones or cement, relying entirely on balance, friction, and accumulated experience. This technique reflects deep architectural knowledge transmitted across generations, because such structures cannot be improvised, and failure would have been immediate and catastrophic. Around this core, additional towers and walls were added, creating a defensive and communal enclosure, not as a single construction event, but through repeated phases of expansion, adaptation, and reinforcement, suggesting that Palmavera was a living site rather than a static monument. Archaeological evidence indicates that people lived and worked here, with remains of hearths, pottery, tools, and animal bones pointing to domestic activity alongside whatever administrative or ritual functions the complex may have served. This combination of residence and monumentality is important because it suggests that power, identity, and daily life were closely integrated, rather than separated into elite and ordinary spaces. The purpose of Nuraghe structures has long been debated, with interpretations ranging from fortresses and watchtowers to ceremonial centers and symbols of territorial control. And Nuraghe Palmavera embodies this ambiguity because it fits partially into each category without fully conforming to any single one. From its elevated position, the complex offers wide views of surrounding land and routes leading toward the coast, reinforcing the idea that visibility and awareness were central to its function. At the same time, the internal spaces are inward-focused, dark, enclosed, and acoustically muted, suggesting that not all activity here was concerned with external observation. This duality hints at a layered purpose, combining surveillance, storage, gathering, and ritual within a single architectural system. The labor required to construct Palmavera would have been immense, involving quarrying, transporting, and shaping large stone blocks using only simple tools, ropes, and human coordination. And such effort implies strong social organization and shared motivation. No evidence exists of centralized kingship or written administration during this period in Sardinia, making the scale of construction even more striking, because it suggests that authority here emerged through consensus, tradition, and communal obligation rather than formal hierarchy. Within the courtyard areas, archaeologists have identified circular huts, some with stone benches and central hearths, indicating spaces where people gathered, worked, and possibly held meetings or rituals. One of these huts, often interpreted as a meeting hut, contains a stone seat that may have been used by a community leader or elder, hinting at informal governance rooted in presence rather than proclamation. Nearby, storage spaces and work areas suggest that Palmavera functioned as a local hub, coordinating agricultural production, craft activity, and exchange with surrounding settlements. The proximity to the coast also placed Palmavera within wider Mediterranean networks, and imported materials and pottery styles indicate contact with Mycenaean, Phoenician, and later cultures, demonstrating that Sardinia was not isolated, but connected through maritime routes. These connections did not erase local traditions, however, because the Nuraga form persisted for centuries, reflecting cultural resilience and continuity even as external influences arrived. Over time, Palmavera underwent modifications, with walls thickened, entrances narrowed, and new towers added, reflecting changing needs, possibly linked to shifting political conditions, population pressures, or environmental stress. Such adaptations reveal a society attentive to circumstance, capable of responding to new challenges without abandoning established architectural language. By the late Bronze Age, many Nuraghe sites, including Palmavera, began to decline in prominence as settlement patterns changed and new forms of organization emerged, yet the structures were not violently destroyed, suggesting transition rather than collapse. Later communities reused portions of the complex, adapting spaces for different purposes, layering new meanings onto ancient foundations. Standing within the ruins today, one is struck by the sense of enclosure and stability, the way the thick stone walls mute sound and isolate interior spaces from the surrounding world, creating an atmosphere that feels deliberate rather than accidental. This sensory quality likely played a role in how the site functioned socially, shaping behavior through architecture rather than explicit rules. Nuraghe Palmavera challenges simplistic interpretations of prehistoric society because it reveals complexity without bureaucracy, monumentality without kingship, and organization without written law. It represents a form of social order grounded in shared practice, collective memory, and repeated cooperation rather than centralized authority. The endurance of the structure speaks to the success of this system because buildings of this scale survive only when maintenance, respect, and relevance are sustained across generations. Palmavera also invites reflection on how communities express identity through architecture, choosing forms that emphasize solidity, continuity, and presence over ornamentation or spectacle. In a world without permanent texts, stone became the medium of memory, carrying social meaning through shape, placement, and repetition. Today, the Nuraga remains embedded in a modern landscape of roads and farms and towns, yet it resists assimilation, standing apart as a reminder of an earlier way of organizing life around cooperation and place. It does not demand interpretation through mystery or speculation, because its significance lies not in hidden secrets, but in visible effort, accumulated knowledge, and quiet persistence. Nuraghe Palmavera shows that long before states, empires, and written history, people were already capable of creating durable systems of architecture, governance, and belonging. And as wind moves across the plateau and light shifts along the curved stone walls, the complex continues to perform its original function, not as a fortress or palace, but as a stable point in a changing world, anchoring memory in stone. Zorat's Karar, Armenia. Zorat's Karar lies on a wide, windswept plateau in southern Armenia, where mountains stretch across the horizon and the land opens into long, quiet distances. And in this setting of open sky and slow-moving clouds, hundreds of dark basalt stones rise from the ground in careful arrangement, forming one of the most unusual and least understood prehistoric landscapes in the Caucasus. The site is also known as Karahunj, a name often translated as speaking stones, a reference to the way wind passes through holes carved into several of the standing pillars, producing faint whistling sounds that shift with weather and season, adding an acoustic dimension to a place already shaped strongly by silence. Zorat's Karar consists of more than 200 upright stones, arranged in circular and linear patterns across the plateau, with some forming a central ring and others extending outward like corridors or pathways, suggesting a design that goes beyond random placement or casual marking. Many of the stones weigh several tons and were transported and positioned without the use of metal tools or wheeled vehicles, implying long-term planning, coordinated labor, and shared purpose within a community that left no written record of its intentions. What distinguishes Zorat's Karar from most other megalithic sites is the presence of precisely carved circular utverstia, or holes, drilled through the upper portions of many stones, aligned in specific directions rather than placed arbitrarily. These holes have become central to debates about the site's function, because they appear to frame segments of sky when viewed from certain positions, raising the possibility that the builders were tracking celestial events, such as solstices, equinoxes, or the movement of prominent stars. Some researchers have proposed that Zorat's Karar functioned as an early astronomical observatory, possibly predating similar sites elsewhere, though this interpretation remains controversial and continues to be examined critically. Other scholars emphasize ritual, territorial, or social explanations, suggesting that the alignments may have served ceremonial purposes, marked seasonal cycles, or reinforced collective identity rather than functioning as precise scientific instruments. The location of the site supports multiple interpretations, because it sits near natural routes connecting valleys and highlands, making it both accessible and prominent, suitable for gathering, observation, and symbolic display. Archaeological excavations in the surrounding area have revealed evidence of long-term human activity, including burials and settlement remains, indicating that Zorat's Karar existed within a broader cultural landscape rather than in isolation. Dating the site has proven difficult, with estimates ranging from the Bronze Age to much earlier periods, reflecting both the absence of organic material and the complexity of interpreting reused or modified stones. This uncertainty itself is revealing, because it suggests that the site may have been used, altered, and reinterpreted over long spans of time, accumulating meaning rather than serving a single fixed function. The stones themselves show signs of weathering, repair, and repositioning, implying ongoing engagement rather than abandonment, and reinforcing the idea that Zorat's Karar was part of a living tradition rather than a one-time construction project. Standing among the stones today, one becomes aware of how movement is guided subtly by their arrangement, encouraging slow circulation around the central circle and along the extending lines, shaping experience through spatial rhythm rather than walls or enclosures. The wind, light, and sound interact constantly with the stones, transforming the site across hours and seasons, suggesting that environmental change may have been central to its meaning. If the holes were indeed used for sky observation, they would have required repeated calibration and shared knowledge, pointing to a tradition of careful observation passed down through generations. Even if astronomical functions were secondary, the precision involved in drilling and aligning the stones reflects advanced technical ability and attention to detail. The choice of dark basalt also matters, because its durability and visual contrast with the surrounding grasslands would have made the stones stand out clearly, reinforcing their presence as fixed reference points. Zorat's Karar does not overwhelm through size or density, but through coherence, because its power lies in the way many individual elements work together to create a unified landscape of meaning. Unlike cities or fortresses, the site offers no clear boundaries, no enclosed interior, and no defensive advantages, suggesting that its importance was symbolic rather than military. This symbolic character may have allowed different groups to use the site cooperatively, sharing access rather than competing for control. Over time, as political systems and belief structures changed, the original context of Zorat's Karar faded, yet the stones remained, preserving the geometry of intention long after memory dissolved. Modern interpretations often oscillate between scientific fascination and cultural pride, reflecting the site's role in contemporary identity as much as in ancient practice. Yet beneath these layers of modern meaning, the stones continue to perform their primary function, whatever it was, simply by standing, aligning, framing, and enduring. Zoroaster reminds us that early societies engaged deeply with landscape, sky, and time, weaving these elements into shared spaces that organized experience without written instruction. It shows that observation, ritual, and community could be embedded directly into stone, creating places where knowledge was enacted rather than recorded. And as clouds move slowly across the Armenian plateau and shadows drift between the pillars, the speaking stones continue their quiet dialogue with wind and light, carrying forward a language shaped by alignment, patience, and collective memory. Philitosa stone statues. Corsica. Philitosa lies in a quiet valley of southern Corsica, where low hills, scattered olive trees, and granite outcrops shape a landscape that feels stable and unhurried. And within this setting stands one of the most unusual prehistoric sites in the Western Mediterranean, a place where stone was not only used for walls or tombs, but shaped deliberately into human form. Unlike many megalithic sites defined by anonymous blocks and abstract geometry, Philitosa is marked by anthropomorphic statues, large carved stones bearing faces, weapons, and bodily outlines, transforming raw granite into figures that appear to watch over the land rather than simply occupy it. These statues, often called statue menhirs, date primarily to the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, roughly between 1500 and 1000 BCE, and represent one of the clearest examples in Europe of prehistoric societies expressing identity and authority through carved imagery. Each statue is unique, yet they share common features, including stylized faces, prominent noses, engraved eyes, and depictions of daggers or swords carved across the torso, suggesting a shared symbolic language understood within the community. The presence of weapons on many statues is especially significant because it implies that these figures were associated with power, protection, or leadership rather than abstract spirituality alone. Rather than representing ordinary individuals, the statues likely embodied idealized ancestors, warriors, or mythic figures whose presence reinforced social order and collective memory. What makes Philitosa particularly intriguing is that these statues were not simply erected and left untouched, but appear to have been deliberately broken, reused, and incorporated into later structures, including defensive walls and towers. Some statues were found embedded horizontally within fortifications, their faces turned inward or obscured, suggesting that later inhabitants intentionally neutralized their symbolic power. This practice indicates cultural transition rather than destruction, where older belief systems were not erased completely, but recontextualized within new social frameworks. Around the statue field, archaeologists have identified circular structures, towers, and habitation areas, revealing that Philitosa functioned as a living settlement rather than an isolated ritual ground. These structures resemble early forms of nuraga-like towers and fortified enclosures, linking Corsica to broader Mediterranean architectural traditions. The site's location near natural routes through the valley suggests that it controlled movement and access, reinforcing the idea that Philitosa held both symbolic and strategic importance. Transporting and carving large granite blocks required specialized knowledge and collective labor, indicating that statue production was not casual, but embedded in organized social practice. The act of carving faces and weapons into stone represents a shift in how power was expressed, moving from abstract monumentality toward personalized symbolism. This shift may reflect changing social structures, as communities became more hierarchical and leadership roles more formalized. The later reuse of statues within defensive architecture suggests increasing concern with security, competition, or conflict, possibly linked to population growth or external contact. Rather than abandoning earlier traditions entirely, the builders integrated them into new forms, preserving memory while reshaping meaning. Standing among the statues today, one becomes aware of their presence as more than archaeological artifacts, because their human-like features create an emotional response that purely geometric monuments rarely evoke. They seem to occupy a space between object and representation, between material and memory, reminding observers that prehistoric societies engaged deeply with visual symbolism. The weathered surfaces, worn faces, and fractured forms record centuries of exposure, reuse, and reinterpretation, turning each statue into a layered historical document. Filitosa challenges the idea that early European societies lacked complex symbolic systems, showing instead that identity, authority, and belief were actively shaped through imagery long before classical art traditions emerged. It also reveals that social change often involves reworking older symbols rather than eliminating them, embedding transformation into physical space. The statue's endurance reflects not only the durability of granite, but the lasting importance of the ideas they once represented. They continue to stand as witnesses to shifting power structures, evolving belief systems, and long-term cultural negotiation. In the broader context of Mediterranean prehistory, Filitosa occupies a transitional position, bridging anonymous megalithic traditions and later figurative representation. It shows how communities began to attach faces, weapons, and personalities to stone, giving form to concepts of leadership, protection, and ancestry. And as light moves across the carved surfaces and shadows deepen within engraved lines, the stone figures remain where they were shaped, silent but expressive, carrying forward a story of human imagination etched into granite. Tholos tomb of Vapheo, Greece. The Tholos, tomb of Vapheo, stands quietly in the rolling plains of Laconia in southern Greece, near the modern town of Sparta, where low hills, open fields, and distant mountain ridges create a landscape that feels unchanged in its basic form for thousands of years. And within this gentle setting lies one of the most refined burial monuments of the Mycenaean world. Unlike towering citadels or dramatic cliffside sanctuaries, this tomb is largely hidden from view, embedded into the earth and revealed only through careful approach, reflecting a funerary tradition that emphasized inward movement rather than outward display. The tomb dates to around the 15th century BCE, during the height of Mycenaean influence in mainland Greece, a period marked by expanding trade networks, increasing social hierarchy, and the emergence of elite warrior rulers. Its structure follows the tholos, or beehive, design, consisting of a long entrance passage known as a dromos, a monumental doorway, and a circular burial chamber constructed through corbelled stonework that rises gradually toward a central apex. This corbelled dome represents one of the highest achievements of Bronze Age engineering in the Aegean, because it required precise control of stone placement, weight distribution, and long-term stability, all accomplished without mortar or metal reinforcement. Each layer of stone projects slightly inward from the one below, forming a self-supporting structure that balances mass and tension through accumulated experience rather than formal calculation. The dromos leading to the tomb is cut directly into the earth and lined with stone, creating a controlled approach that slows movement and frames the transition from the world of the living to the domain of the dead. This gradual descent would have prepared participants psychologically and socially for the rituals that followed, reinforcing the separation between ordinary life and funerary ceremony. At the end of this passage, a monumental doorway once sealed the chamber, marking the threshold between visibility and concealment, between presence and memory. Inside, the chamber opens into a high, circular space that feels both enclosed and expansive, designed to hold not only physical remains but symbolic meaning, anchoring elite identity within permanent architecture. Excavations at Vapheo revealed exceptionally rich grave goods, including gold cups decorated with detailed scenes of bull capture, now known as the Vapheo cups, which reflect advanced craftsmanship and connections to Minoan Crete. These objects indicate that the individual buried here belonged to the highest social stratum, likely a local ruler or elite figure whose power extended through trade, military influence, and ritual authority. The presence of such luxury items also suggests that funerary display played an important role in reinforcing status, allowing wealth and prestige to persist beyond death. At the same time, the tomb's restrained exterior contrasts with its elaborate contents, reflecting a cultural balance between public modesty and private magnificence. The placement of the tomb within the broader landscape reinforces this duality because it stands near fertile land and strategic routes, linking elite burial to territorial control and economic production. Vafeo was not an isolated monument, but part of a wider network of Mycenaean Tholos tombs spread across southern Greece, each marking centers of regional authority. Yet despite this common form, each tomb displays subtle variations, reflecting local traditions, political autonomy, and competitive display among elites. The construction of such a tomb would have required large labor forces, skilled stoneworkers, and centralized coordination, indicating that power here was already institutionalized rather than purely personal. This investment in burial architecture reflects a worldview in which legitimacy and memory were secured through monumentality, binding leadership to place through stone. Over time, as Mycenaean political systems weakened and collapsed, many Tholos tombs were looted, reused, or abandoned, yet their structures remained, continuing to shape the landscape long after their original meanings faded. The tomb of Vafeo survived largely intact, allowing modern archaeology to reconstruct aspects of Mycenaean social life with unusual clarity. Standing inside the chamber today, one becomes aware of the acoustic and visual qualities of the space, how sound softens and light concentrates upward, creating an atmosphere that feels deliberately composed. This sensory control suggests that the tomb was designed not merely as a container for remains, but as a stage for ritual experience. It reminds us that burial in Mycenaean society was a public act, involving community participation, symbolic display, and repeated visitation. The tomb functioned as a long-term anchor for elite identity, connecting generations through shared memory and inherited authority. In this way, Vafeo reflects a broader transformation in Bronze Age Greece, as leadership shifted from loosely organized communities toward more formalized political structures. The architecture embodies this shift, translating hierarchy into stone and permanence. Yet despite its elite associations, the tomb also reflects collective effort, because its construction depended on cooperation and shared labor as much as command. The Tholos tomb of Vafeo thus stands at the intersection of power and community, individuality and tradition, memory and material. It reveals how early complex societies negotiated authority through architecture, embedding social order into landscape. And as seasons pass over the plains of Laconia and shadows move slowly across the stone-lined entrance, the tomb continues to hold its place, preserving the quiet presence of a world where leadership, ritual, and memory were bound together beneath the earth. Dumat al-Jandal, Stone Fortress, Saudi Arabia. Dumat al-Jandal rises from the desert landscapes of northern Saudi Arabia, where flat plains stretch toward distant horizons, and seasonal winds reshape the surface again and again. And within this environment of constant change stands a fortress built almost entirely from stone, projecting stability into a setting defined by movement. At the center of this ancient settlement stands Marid Castle, the massive stone fortress that has dominated Dumat al-Jandal for more than 2,000 years, overlooking caravan routes that once connected Arabia to Mesopotamia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean world. This location was not chosen by accident, because Dumat al-Jandal occupied a strategic crossroads where water sources, trade paths, and defensive advantage converged, making it a natural point of control within long-distance exchange networks. The fortress itself was constructed in phases, beginning in antiquity and expanded across Nabatean, Roman, and later Islamic periods, reflecting the site's continued importance across changing political systems. Its thick stone walls, reinforced towers, and elevated position were designed to withstand both military threat and environmental pressure, offering protection against attack, sandstorms, and extreme temperature variation. Unlike temporary desert settlements built from mud brick or organic materials, Marid Castle represents a deliberate choice to invest in permanence, anchoring authority in stone rather than adaptability. Within the walls, traces of residential spaces, storage rooms, and water management features reveal that the fortress was not only a military structure, but a functioning center of administration and daily life. Cisterns and wells were essential to survival here, and their integration into the fortress design shows that control of water was inseparable from control of territory. Historical sources mention Dumat al-Jandal as early as Assyrian records, confirming its long-standing role as a regional power center long before the rise of Islam. Later, during Roman influence in Arabia, the site became part of frontier defense systems, linking it to broader imperial strategies of surveillance and regulation. Yet despite these external connections, local traditions remain strong, and the fortress reflects a hybrid architecture shaped by multiple cultural influences rather than imposed uniformity. The walls are built from roughly cut limestone blocks, carefully stacked and reinforced, demonstrating practical engineering adapted to available materials and climate. Their thickness provided insulation as well as defense, moderating interior temperatures in a region where daytime heat and nighttime cold could be extreme. Movement within the fortress was deliberately constrained, with narrow passages, elevated lookouts, and controlled entry points, shaping how inhabitants and visitors experienced authority. This spatial control reduced the need for constant physical enforcement, allowing architecture itself to regulate behavior. Over centuries, the fortress witnessed shifting patterns of trade, warfare, and governance, yet it remained occupied, adapted, and maintained, reflecting its resilience and continued relevance. Unlike cities that declined rapidly after losing political importance, Dumat al-Jandal adjusted gradually, preserving its role as a regional anchor. The surrounding settlement expanded and contracted around the fortress, reinforcing its function as a stable core within a changing landscape. Standing atop the walls today, one can see how visibility shaped power here, because long sight lines allowed early detection of approaching caravans or potential threats. This emphasis on observation aligns with broader desert strategies, where information and timing often mattered more than sheer force. The fortress also served symbolic functions, projecting authority to traders, travelers, and neighboring communities long before any interaction occurred. Its silhouette against the desert horizon communicated permanence, order, and control in a space where few structures could offer such reassurance. As political systems evolved and new centers emerged, Dumat al-Jandal's prominence diminished, yet the fortress remained, reused and respected rather than abandoned. This continuity reflects cultural attachment to place, where memory and utility reinforced each other across generations. Today, Marad Castle stands as one of the best preserved stone fortresses in Arabia, offering rare insight into how desert societies translated mobility and trade into fixed architecture. It reveals that even in environments defined by movement, people sought stability through construction, embedding authority into enduring materials. Dumat al-Jandal challenges stereotypes of ancient Arabia as purely nomadic, showing instead a complex interplay between mobility and settlement, trade and defense, flexibility and permanence. It demonstrates that power in desert regions often depended on controlling nodes rather than territories, securing key points rather than vast expanses. And as winds continue to sweep across the plains, and caravans are replaced by highways and towns, the stone fortress remains where it was built, marking a place where routes, resources, and human ambition once converged. Carthage Tawfet Platforms, Tunisia. Along the northern coast of Tunisia, where the Mediterranean meets low hills and shallow bays, the ruins of ancient Carthage spread quietly across modern suburbs and open ground, and among temples, ports, and streets lies one of the most debated and emotionally charged spaces in the ancient Mediterranean world, the Tawfet. Unlike fortresses, palaces, or public squares, the Tawfet was not a place of power or administration, but a ritual landscape defined by low stone platforms, urn burials, and carved stelae arranged across an open area that functioned as a sacred space rather than a settlement. The Carthaginian Tawfet was used over many centuries, from roughly the 8th century BCE until the Roman destruction of the city in 146 BCE, reflecting extraordinary continuity in religious practice. Within this space, archaeologists uncovered thousands of urns buried beneath the ground, each containing cremated remains of infants, young children, and sometimes small animals, carefully placed beneath stone markers. These urns were arranged in layers, forming a rising field of ritual deposits, gradually transforming the landscape into a platform of memory built through repetition rather than monumentality. Stone stelae placed above many urns bear symbols, inscriptions, and stylized images associated with Punic deities, particularly Baal Hammon and Tanit, reinforcing the religious function of the site. The low platforms and terraced surfaces helped organize this expanding burial field, creating ordered zones for deposition rather than random placement. This careful spatial management suggests that the Tophet was regulated and maintained by religious authorities, rather than functioning as an informal burial ground. The purpose of the Tophet has been debated intensely, because ancient Greek and Roman writers accused the Carthaginians of practicing child sacrifice, while some modern scholars argue that the site represents a specialized cemetery for infants who died naturally. Scientific analysis has shown that many remains belong to very young children, including newborns. Yet interpretation remains complex, because cremation obscures causes of death and cultural context cannot be reconstructed fully from bone alone. What is clear is that the Tophet was not hidden or marginal, but integrated into Carthage's sacred geography, located near important urban and ceremonial areas. This placement indicates that the rituals performed here were socially recognized and institutionally supported, whatever their precise meaning. The repetition of urn burials over centuries points to standardized practice rather than isolated events, suggesting that participation followed established religious frameworks. Families who brought offerings here were engaging in shared tradition, linking private loss to collective belief. The platforms and terraces shaped movement within the Tophet, guiding visitors through layers of memory and ritual rather than enclosing them within walls. Unlike tombs that conceal the dead, the Tophet accumulated presence over time, building upward through repeated deposition. This vertical growth transformed absence into architecture, creating a landscape composed of loss, devotion, and continuity. The simplicity of the structures is notable because there are no grand temples or towering monuments within the Tophet itself, reinforcing the idea that meaning here was created through practice rather than display. The surrounding stelae functioned as markers of participation, recording names, prayers, and gratitude toward deities, anchoring individual experiences within communal tradition. Over time, as Carthage expanded and political circumstances changed, the Tophet remained active, demonstrating remarkable religious stability. Even during periods of war, trade disruption, and foreign influence, ritual life here continued largely unchanged. When Rome destroyed Carthage, the Tophet was abandoned along with the rest of the city, its function ending abruptly rather than gradually. Later, Roman construction buried much of the site, sealing it beneath new urban layers and removing it from living memory for centuries. Modern excavation reopened difficult questions about belief, ethics, and interpretation, reminding us that ancient religion cannot be understood solely through modern moral frameworks. The Tophet challenges simplified narratives about Carthaginian society, showing that ritual practice was deeply structured, regulated, and socially embedded. It reveals a community that used architecture and repetition to manage grief, obligation, and devotion within shared symbolic systems. Rather than offering clear answers, the site preserves ambiguity, forcing historians to confront the limits of textual bias, archaeological evidence, and cultural translation. Standing within the Tophet today, one senses that its power lies not in spectacle, but in accumulation, in thousands of small acts repeated across generations. Each urn represents a private moment absorbed into collective memory, transformed into part of a larger ritual landscape. The platforms and terraces remain as traces of this process, marking how belief was materialized through quiet persistence rather than monumental display. Carthage's Tophet reminds us that ancient architecture was not always built to celebrate life, authority, or victory, but sometimes to manage loss, uncertainty, and devotion. It shows how societies created spaces where personal experience could be absorbed into shared cosmology. And as the Mediterranean continues to move beside the ruins and modern life flows around the ancient city, the Tophet remains a silent archive of ritual, belief, and unresolved human questions, preserved in stone, ash, and memory. Tula Atlantean Columns, Mexico. The Atlantean columns of Tula rise above the high plains of central Mexico, where dry air, open skies, and distant volcanic silhouettes shape a landscape that feels wide and exposed, and on a low platform at the heart of the ancient city stand four massive stone figures, upright, silent, and carefully aligned. These figures once supported the roof of a large ceremonial structure, known today as Pyramid B, and although the building itself has long since collapsed, the columns remain, preserving the human form in architectural function. Carved from basalt and standing over 4 meters tall, each column represents a warrior figure, complete with feathered headdress, atlatl spear thrower, chest ornaments, and sandals, transforming structural supports into symbolic representations of authority and identity. This integration of sculpture and architecture reflects a worldview in which power, belief, and construction were inseparable, and where buildings did not merely house ritual, but embodied it. The city of Tula, known in Nahuatl as Tulan, flourished between the 10th and 12th centuries CE as the capital of the Toltec civilization, a culture remembered in later Mesoamerican tradition as a model of order, knowledge, and legitimacy. Although the Toltecs left few written records, their influence appears repeatedly in later Aztec myths and political ideology, where rulers trace their authority back to Tula as a symbolic origin point. The Atlantean figures played a central role in this symbolic landscape, representing idealized warrior priests whose discipline and devotion supported both religious and political order. By shaping roof supports as human figures, the builders created a visual metaphor in which the stability of society rested literally on disciplined individuals. Each column was carved in segments and assembled vertically, demonstrating advanced stoneworking techniques and precise coordination between artisans and architects. The alignment and spacing of the figures reflect careful planning, ensuring both structural stability and visual coherence. Around Pyramid B, evidence of plazas, ball courts, and additional ceremonial platforms reveals that Tula functioned as a complex urban center rather than an isolated temple site. These surrounding spaces facilitated public ritual, gatherings, and political display, integrating the Atlanteans into a wider performative landscape. The location of the columns at an elevated platform reinforced their visibility, allowing them to dominate sightlines and shape how visitors experienced approach and entry. From below, the figures appear both human and monumental, familiar in form yet distant in scale, reinforcing authority through controlled representation. The decline of Tula remains debated, with evidence pointing to internal conflict, environmental stress, and shifting trade networks rather than sudden invasion. As the city weakened, ceremonial structures fell into disuse, roofs collapsed, and plazas emptied, leaving the columns exposed to wind, rain, and time. Yet the Atlanteans remained standing, partly due to their mass and careful placement, and partly because later cultures preserved their symbolic significance. When the Aztecs encountered the ruins centuries later, they treated Tula as a sacred ancestral city, reinforcing its mythic status within their own political narratives. This continued reverence helped protect the site from complete destruction, allowing key monuments to survive into the modern era. Standing beside the columns today, one becomes aware of their dual function because they are simultaneously statues and supports, symbols and structural elements. They remind us that in many ancient societies, art was not separate from engineering, and belief was not confined to temples alone. The figures do not depict individual rulers, but archetypes, disciplined, armed, and standardized, reflecting collective ideals rather than personal glory. This emphasis on idealized form suggests that Toltec authority was grounded in shared values rather than lineage alone. The absence of inscriptions or personal names reinforces this abstraction, allowing the columns to represent continuity rather than biography. Tula's Atlanteans thus embody a system where power was distributed symbolically through repetition and uniformity. They demonstrate how architecture could be used to teach, reinforce, and stabilize social norms without written instruction. Over time, erosion softened their features and fractured some components, yet their posture remains unchanged, upright, aligned, and forward-facing. This persistence mirrors the enduring influence of Toltec culture within Mesoamerican memory. The columns continue to shape how the site is experienced, guiding movement, framing views, and anchoring attention. They transform an open platform into a focused space of meaning through presence. Alone. Tula challenges the idea that monumental architecture must rely on mass alone, showing instead how form, symbolism, and placement can achieve lasting authority. The Atlantean columns stand not as isolated artworks, but as integrated elements of a broader social and ritual system. And as clouds drift across the Mexican plateau and light shifts along their carved surfaces, the stone warriors remain where they were placed, still supporting, still representing, still holding together a story of discipline, belief, and architectural imagination. Hattusa Tunnel Gate, Turkey. The Tunnel Gate of Hattusa lies beneath the ruined walls of an ancient capital in central Anatolia, where rolling hills, dry grasslands, and exposed rock define a landscape that appears open and vulnerable, yet once supported one of the most powerful empires of the Bronze Age. Hattusa served as the capital of the Hittite Empire between the 17th and 12th centuries BCE, a political system that rivaled Egypt and Mesopotamia in influence, diplomacy, and military organization. Yet much of its strength was rooted not in spectacle, but in careful planning and controlled movement. Among the city's most distinctive features is the Yerkapi Tunnel, a long stone-lined passage built beneath an artificial embankment that formed part of the southern fortifications, creating a hidden gateway through the defensive wall. From the outside, this section of wall appears solid and continuous, offering no obvious point of entry. Yet beneath it runs a carefully constructed corridor over 70 meters long, wide enough for people to pass through while remaining concealed. The tunnel is built from massive limestone blocks arranged in corbelled fashion, forming a triangular cross-section that distributes weight and prevents collapse, demonstrating advanced engineering knowledge long before formal architectural theory. This construction technique mirrors methods used in contemporary Mycenaean tombs and fortifications, suggesting shared technological traditions across the eastern Mediterranean world. The purpose of the tunnel has been debated, with interpretations ranging from military escape route to ceremonial entrance, drainage channel, or controlled access point for elite movement. What is clear is that the tunnel was not improvised, because its scale, alignment, and structural complexity reflect long-term planning and centralized coordination. If used for military purposes, it would have allowed troops to move in and out of the city, discreetly, bypassing main gates during siege or conflict. If used ceremonially, it may have formed part of ritual processions, guiding participants through darkness before re-emerging into public space, reinforcing symbolic transition. These interpretations are not mutually exclusive because Hittite architecture often combined practical and ritual functions within the same structure. The tunnel's placement beneath Yerkapi, the highest point of the city's fortifications, reinforces its strategic importance, linking concealed movement to elevated defense. Above the tunnel, massive earthworks and stone walls created a formidable barrier, making this section of Hattusa appear nearly impenetrable from a distance. Yet beneath this display of strength lay a hidden passage, revealing that Hittite defense relied as much on flexibility as on force. The surrounding walls included multiple gates decorated with lion and sphinx sculptures, emphasizing the symbolic dimension of entry and exit, where movement was framed by imagery and authority. In contrast, the tunnel gate remains undecorated, emphasizing function over display, secrecy over spectacle. This contrast reflects a broader pattern in Hittite urban planning, where public spaces projected power while internal systems prioritized efficiency and control. Archaeological evidence indicates that Hattusa was meticulously planned, with administrative buildings, temples, storage facilities, and residential zones arranged according to hierarchical logic. The tunnel fits within this system, providing a regulated channel that reduced unpredictability in movement. Such regulation would have been essential in a capital managing diplomats, traders, soldiers, and officials from across Anatolia and beyond. During periods of conflict with Egypt, Assyria, and rival Anatolian states, Hattusa's fortifications played a critical role in sustaining political stability. Yet despite this strength, the city was eventually abandoned around 1200 BCE during the broader collapse of Bronze Age systems across the eastern Mediterranean. The tunnel, along with much of the city's infrastructure, was left intact, sealed by sediment and time rather than destroyed by violence. Later populations passed nearby, but rarely occupied the ruins directly, preserving Hattusa as a frozen architectural landscape. Standing inside the tunnel today, one experiences a sharp contrast between external openness and internal enclosure, between bright Anatolian light and controlled shadow. The temperature drops slightly, sound softens, and perception narrows, creating an atmosphere that feels deliberately engineered. This sensory shift suggests that movement through the tunnel was meant to be experienced as a transition, not merely a shortcut. It reinforced awareness of crossing boundaries, entering and leaving spaces of authority. The tunnel also reveals how ancient states invested in infrastructure that was invisible, most of the time, yet essential during moments of crisis. It reminds us that power is often sustained through systems that remain hidden until they are needed. Hattusa's tunnel gate embodies this principle, representing preparedness rather than display, adaptability rather than rigidity. It shows how the Hittites translated political complexity into physical space, embedding strategy into stone. Rather than relying solely on walls and towers, they created layered defenses that combined visibility with concealment. And as wind moves across the empty embankments and shadows stretch along the ancient corridor, the tunnel remains as it was built, a quiet channel through a vanished empire, preserving the logic of a world where security, symbolism, and movement were carefully intertwined. Karnak, the mud brick labyrinth. Karnak sits on a gently sloping hill near the desert edge in the Yazd region of central Iran, a landscape where sand, sun, and sparse vegetation shape human existence over millennia. And within this austere setting lies one of the largest and most atmospheric collections of mud brick architecture anywhere in the world, a place that feels both abandoned and strangely alive. At first glance, Karnak appears as a collection of earthen walls, domed rooftops, and crumbling alleys, all hewn from sun-dried mud bricks, a material that seems fragile in theory, yet here has endured for centuries because its very imperfections have become part of its resilience. The village's name means birthplace of the sun, and its origins stretch back thousands of years, with evidence suggesting settlement here over 4,000 years ago, though much of what remains today is roughly 1,000 years old, reflecting continuous adaptation, repair, and reuse across generations. Unlike stone forts or monumental tombs, the architecture at Karnak was built for everyday life. Homes, lanes, towers, and public spaces arranged in a seemingly unplanned maze of narrow passages, hidden corners, and rooftop walkways that create an almost labyrinthine environment, inviting both exploration and disorientation. Walking through the old town, one becomes acutely aware of the tactile quality of mud brick, how its rounded shapes and softened edges make walls feel almost organic, like extensions of the earth itself rather than constructed objects, and how every alley leads unpredictably upward, downward, or into shadowed recesses. This choice of material was not merely economical, but ecological, because mud brick, made from local clay, straw, and water, provided thermal comfort in extreme heat, absorbing warmth by day and releasing it slowly at night, a passive system of climate control refined through generations of builders. Above the muddy labyrinth rises one of the site's most unusual architectural features, an oscillating minaret, a slender clay tower that, despite being built entirely of earthen materials, can sway slightly when pushed, a phenomenon that defies ordinary expectations of mud brick stability and suggests careful structural design. The village also contains a large caravanserai, a resting house for travelers and merchants who once traversed long trade routes through the desert, reminding us that Karnak was never isolated, but part of wider networks of exchange, cultural flow, and human movement. Water management was central to life here, and ancient kanats, subterranean channels designed to bring water from distant sources, sustained agriculture and daily use, anchoring the settlement to an environment where scarcity defined both challenge and ingenuity. Over centuries, as water sources diminished and trade routes shifted, the old town gradually emptied, its inhabitants relocating to a newer settlement nearby, leaving behind ramparts, homes, worship spaces, and silent alleys that now crumble beneath sun and sand. Yet even in ruin, Karanak's layered architecture communicates social life rather than abandonment, because each courtyard, passage, and rooftop speaks of movement, repetition, and memory, not monumental display, but lived experience. The settlement's organic growth defies simple classification, resisting comparison with stone fortresses, megalithic tombs, or ceremonial platforms, and instead embodies a human scale of architecture built in harmony with climate, resource, and community need. This fusion of fragility and endurance makes Karanak exceptional because it forces us to reconsider how permanence is understood, not through grand materials or lofty monuments, but through structures that endure by bending with seasonal extremes and social change rather than by resisting them. Standing among these mud walls today, one can almost hear echoes of 1,000 lifetimes, children running through alleys, merchants bargaining at the caravanserai, water flowing through kanats, and everyday tasks unfolding in shaded spaces, creating a layered human echo that survives in texture rather than inscription. Karanak challenges assumptions about ancient architecture, reminding us that complexity and adaptation often arise not from monumental ambition, but from necessity, creativity, and deep engagement with place. And as desert winds move through cracked walls and collapsing rooftops, the village remains, not simply a ruin, but a lasting archive of how humans once shaped Earth and lived within the constraints of nature itself. Alula Dadanite Tombs, Saudi Arabia. In the sandstone valleys of Alula, where towering rock formations rise from golden desert plains and narrow passages carve their way between cliffs, the Dadanite tombs are cut directly into stone, blending so completely with their surroundings that they appear less like monuments and more like extensions of the landscape itself. This region was once the heartland of the ancient kingdoms of Dadan and Lihian, flourishing between roughly the 6th and 1st centuries BCE, long before Alula became known for its later Nabatean monuments, and the tombs preserved here belong to this earlier, often overlooked chapter of Arabian history. Unlike freestanding structures built to dominate space, the Dadanite tombs withdraw into rock faces, concealed within cliffs and narrow valleys, suggesting a funerary tradition focused on permanence through integration rather than display. Each tomb was carved by hand into sandstone, requiring careful planning and sustained labor, because mistakes in carving could not be reversed, and structural failure would have compromised the chamber permanently. The entrances are typically rectangular or trapezoidal, framed precisely and cut at consistent heights, indicating standardized practices rather than isolated improvisation. Above many doorways are inscriptions written in Dadanitic script, recording names, lineages, and legal warnings, reminding visitors that these spaces were protected by social authority as well as physical stone. These inscriptions represent some of the earliest written records in Arabia, revealing a society that valued documentation, inheritance, and regulated ownership. Inside, the chambers are modest and functional, designed for multiple burials rather than individual display, reinforcing collective identity over personal glorification. This shared use suggests that family groups or clans maintained long-term relationships with specific tombs, returning across generations to reaffirm belonging. The placement of tombs high on cliff faces is significant because it required scaffolding, ropes, and technical coordination, indicating that burial was a major communal investment rather than a private act. Elevation also limited access, protecting the tombs from disturbance and reinforcing separation between the living and the dead. The broader landscape of Dadanite Alula included temples, water systems, agricultural terraces, and caravan infrastructure, forming a complex urban network sustained by oasis management and long-distance trade. The tombs functioned within this system, anchoring social memory to specific locations within productive territory. Control of water and trade routes made Dadan and Lihian prosperous, allowing resources to be invested in durable funerary architecture rather than temporary solutions. The style of the tombs reflects both local tradition and external influence, because Alula lay along major caravan routes, linking southern Arabia, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. This position exposed its inhabitants to architectural and cultural ideas from multiple regions, which were selectively adapted rather than copied. Over time, political power shifted, and the Nabateans rose to prominence, constructing their own rock-cut tombs nearby, which eventually overshadowed the earlier Dadanite monuments. Yet the Dadanite tombs were not erased, remaining visible reminders of older authority beneath newer layers of history. When Roman and later Islamic systems reshaped Arabia, Alula's role evolved again, and many tombs faded into quiet neglect, preserved more by isolation than protection. Standing among the cliffs today, one becomes aware of how carefully space was organized, how burial, settlement, agriculture, and trade were interwoven into a single cultural landscape. The tombs do not dominate this landscape, but stabilize it, acting as fixed points of memory within a world shaped by movement. Their restraint reflects a worldview in which status was affirmed through continuity rather than spectacle. The inscriptions emphasize responsibility and lineage, reminding descendants of obligations rather than celebrating personal achievement. This emphasis suggests a society oriented toward long-term stability rather than short-term display. The Dadanite tombs also challenge simplified views of pre-Islamic Arabia, showing advanced literacy, governance, and architectural planning long before imperial domination. They reveal communities capable of regulating property, managing resources, and coordinating labor across generations. In this way, the tombs functioned as both burial spaces and legal markers, embedding social order directly into stone. They transformed cliffs into archives of identity, responsibility, and memory. As sunlight moves across the canyon walls and shadows gather around carved entrances, the tombs remain where they were cut, neither hidden nor exaggerated, continuing to mark the presence of a society that once balanced trade, belief, and governance in one of the world's most demanding environments. And in their quiet persistence, they remind us that some of the most enduring monuments are those that seek not attention, but permanence. Cahuachi Ceremonial Center, Peru. Cahuachi lies on the edge of Peru's southern desert, near the Nazca River, where dry plains stretch outward toward distant mountains, and rainfall is rare enough to make every drop of water meaningful. And within this fragile environment rises one of the largest ceremonial complexes in ancient South America, built not from stone, but from sun-dried earth. At first glance, Cahuachi appears as a series of low, eroded mounds and stepped platforms, their outlines softened by centuries of wind and sand. Yet beneath this subdued surface lies evidence of a highly organized ritual center that once drew people from across the Nazca region. The site flourished between roughly 100 BCE and 500 CE, during the height of Nazca culture, and unlike later Andean cities, Cahuachi was not a permanent urban settlement, but a ceremonial gathering place visited periodically rather than inhabited continuously. This distinction is crucial, because it means that Cahuachi functioned more as a destination than a city, a place people traveled to for ritual, exchange, and social reaffirmation, rather than for everyday life. The core of the complex consists of large adobe pyramids, plazas, and platforms, constructed in repeated phases that gradually increased in height and complexity over generations. Each building phase involved covering earlier structures with new layers of earth and brick, creating architectural palimpsests that preserved past ritual spaces within newer ones. This practice suggests reverence for continuity, where older sacred areas were not destroyed, but absorbed into expanding monuments. The largest structure, known as the Great Pyramid, dominates the site, rising above surrounding platforms and shaping movement and visibility across the complex. Its stepped form created controlled approaches, guiding participants through sequences of ascent and enclosure that structured ritual experience. Excavations have revealed offerings of textiles, ceramics, musical instruments, shells, and food remains, indicating that ceremonies here involved sensory engagement, sound, color, and shared consumption. These offerings reflect long-distance exchange networks because many materials originated far beyond the desert valley, reinforcing Cahuachi's role as a regional hub. Water played a central role in Cahuachi's significance because the Nazca River and underground aquifers sustained life in an otherwise hostile environment. Ritual activity at the site appears closely linked to seasonal cycles, rainfall patterns, and agricultural uncertainty, suggesting that ceremonies here sought to negotiate balance between human need and environmental risk. Unlike militarized centers or administrative capitals, Cahuachi shows little evidence of defensive structures, weaponry, or centralized governance. Instead, authority here seems to have been exercised through ritual leadership, symbolism, and control of sacred knowledge, rather than coercion. Priests and ceremonial specialists likely coordinated events, organizing construction, offerings, and gatherings without relying on standing armies or permanent bureaucracy. This form of leadership depended on credibility and tradition rather than force. The layout of the complex reinforces this interpretation because open plazas allowed large crowds to gather, while elevated platforms separated ritual performers from participants without completely isolating them. This partial separation maintained visibility and engagement while reinforcing hierarchy. Over time, Cahuachi experienced episodes of flooding, erosion, and structural damage, yet continued to be rebuilt, reflecting sustained commitment despite environmental challenge. Eventually, however, climatic shifts and social change reduced the site's relevance, and large-scale ceremonies ceased. Rather than collapsing violently, Cahuachi was ritually closed, with offerings placed deliberately before abandonment, suggesting an intentional conclusion rather than neglect. This ceremonial closure reflects a worldview in which sacred spaces were managed consciously, with beginnings and endings marked through formal action. After abandonment, wind and sand slowly reshaped the adobe structures, returning them gradually to the desert. Yet despite this erosion, the site retains its spatial logic, allowing modern observers to reconstruct how movement, gathering, and ritual once unfolded. Standing among the platforms today, one senses that Cahuachi was designed not for permanence in material, but for endurance in meaning. Adobe was chosen because it was accessible, renewable, and compatible with environmental conditions, reflecting practical adaptation rather than architectural weakness. The builders understood that structures could be rebuilt, but relationships with water, land, and community required constant renewal. Cahuachi challenges assumptions that monumentality requires stone, showing instead that earth, when organized through belief and labor, can achieve comparable social power. It reveals how societies without cities or armies created large-scale coordination through shared ritual. The site embodies a form of complexity rooted in gathering rather than governing, participation rather than control. And as desert winds continue to move across the valley and light shifts along the faded platforms, Cahuachi remains as a quiet record of how people once came together to negotiate uncertainty, memory, and survival through architecture shaped by faith and cooperation. Los Millares Fortifications, Spain. Los Millares lies on a low plateau overlooking the Andarax River Valley in southeastern Spain, where dry hills, scattered vegetation, and distant mountain ridges shape a landscape that feels open yet exposed. And in this setting stands one of the earliest and most complex fortified settlements in prehistoric Europe. From a distance, the site appears as a series of low stone lines tracing the contours of the hill. Yet as one approaches, these lines resolve into multiple concentric walls, towers, and gateways, forming a layered defensive system that reveals long-term planning rather than reactive construction. Los Millares flourished during the Copper Age, between roughly 3200 and 2300 BCE, a period when metallurgy, trade, and population growth were transforming social organization across Iberia. Unlike earlier open settlements, this community invested heavily in fortification, enclosing itself behind stone barriers that reshaped the landscape into a controlled space. The main settlement was protected by 3 successive stone walls, each reinforced with semicircular bastions and narrow gateways, creating multiple zones of access that slowed movement and regulated entry. Beyond these walls lay an outer landscape of tombs, workshops, and satellite structures, extending the defensive logic outward into the surrounding territory. This layered system suggests that security was a central concern, reflecting rising competition over resources, trade routes, and metal production. Copper smelting and tool-making were major activities at Los Millares, and control of metallurgical knowledge likely increased both wealth and vulnerability. Protecting skilled labor, raw materials, and finished goods would have been essential to maintaining regional influence. The fortifications were built from local stone, carefully fitted and reinforced with earth, demonstrating practical engineering adapted to terrain and available resources. Towers positioned along the walls provided elevated viewpoints, allowing surveillance across valleys and approach routes. Gateways were narrow and angled, forcing visitors to slow and change direction, reducing the effectiveness of sudden attack and increasing opportunities for inspection. These architectural choices show that defense here was systematic rather than symbolic. Inside the walls, remains of houses, storage spaces, and workshops reveal a densely organized settlement where daily life unfolded within a framework of constant awareness. The proximity of domestic and defensive structures suggests that security was integrated into routine existence rather than reserved for crisis. Outside the main enclosure, more than 80 collective tombs were constructed, mostly in the form of tholos chambers and passage graves, forming a funerary landscape closely linked to the living community. This proximity between settlement and burial reflects strong continuity between generations, reinforcing identity through shared space. The tombs also indicate social differentiation, with variation in size and grave goods suggesting emerging hierarchy alongside communal traditions. Los Millares thus represents a transitional society, balancing cooperation with competition, collective identity with increasing stratification. Trade connections extended across Iberia and into North Africa, bringing exotic materials such as ivory and obsidian, further increasing the settlement's strategic importance. These networks made Los Millares both prosperous and exposed, reinforcing the need for strong defenses. Over time, environmental stress, resource depletion, and shifting trade patterns weakened the site's position, leading to gradual abandonment rather than sudden collapse. The walls were not violently breached, and there is little evidence of large-scale destruction, suggesting that decline resulted from broader systemic change. Standing among the ruins, today, one can trace the logic of movement and control, seeing how walls guided paths, restricted access, and shaped social interaction. The fortifications were not merely barriers, but organizational tools that structured community life. Los Millares challenges the idea that fortification emerges only with states or armies, showing that even early agricultural societies recognized the need to manage risk through architecture. It reveals how security concerns can accelerate technological, political, and social development. The site marks a moment when European communities began to translate anxiety, competition, and ambition into permanent structures. Yet despite its defensive character, Los Millares was also a place of innovation, exchange, and cultural creativity. Its walls protected not only people, but knowledge, skills, and relationships. And as light moves across the stone circuits and shadows settle into abandoned gateways, the fortifications remain as silent records of how early societies learned to live within boundaries they built for themselves. Timgad Street Grid, Algeria. Timgad lies at the northern edge of the Sahara in eastern Algeria, where dry plains meet the foothills of the RS Mountains, and in this transitional landscape between desert and pasture stands one of the most perfectly preserved examples of Roman urban planning in the ancient world. Founded around the year 100 CE by Emperor Trajan, Timgad was established as a colony for retired Roman soldiers, a settlement designed not to grow organically, but to be built all at once according to a precise geometric plan. From above, the city reveals a near-perfect grid, with streets intersecting at right angles, dividing space into uniform blocks that create an ordered framework for movement, residence, and administration. At the heart of this system lie two main avenues, the Cardo running north to south and the Decumanus running east to west, whose intersection formed the civic center of the city. This layout was not merely practical, but ideological, because it expressed Roman values of control, rationality, and predictability through architecture. By imposing a grid onto open land, Roman authorities translated political order into physical space. Every street, block, and plaza was assigned function and proportion, reducing uncertainty and reinforcing administrative oversight. Public buildings were positioned deliberately within this framework, including the forum, basilica, theater, baths, temples, and markets, creating a balanced civic environment that supported social, economic, and cultural life. Water systems, drainage channels, and sewers were integrated beneath streets, demonstrating advanced infrastructure planning that supported long-term habitation. Residential neighborhoods followed standardized patterns, with courtyard houses arranged systematically rather than clustered irregularly. This regularity made expansion, taxation, and governance easier, reflecting the bureaucratic logic underlying Roman colonization. Timgad's location along regional trade routes allowed it to function as both a military outpost and a commercial hub, linking interior North Africa with Mediterranean networks. The surrounding landscape supported agriculture and livestock, providing economic stability for the settlement. Over time, the city prospered, accumulating monuments, inscriptions, and artistic works that reflected growing wealth and cultural integration. Yet despite this growth, the original grid remained intact, absorbing change without losing structure. This adaptability reveals the strength of modular planning, where standardized units could be modified without destabilizing the whole. During late antiquity, political instability, economic decline, and environmental change weakened Roman authority in North Africa. As trade networks shifted and security deteriorated, Timgad's population gradually declined. Rather than being violently destroyed, the city was slowly abandoned, its buildings collapsing and its streets filling with sand. Desert winds buried much of the site, sealing it beneath sediment and protecting it from later reuse. This burial preserved the street grid with exceptional clarity, allowing modern archaeologists to reconstruct urban life in remarkable detail. When excavated in the 19th and 20th centuries, Timgad emerged almost intact, revealing a frozen snapshot of Roman municipal design. Walking through the city today, one experiences a sense of openness and clarity rarely found in ancient ruins. Sightlines remain long and unobstructed, intersections remain legible, and spatial relationships remain coherent. The grid continues to guide movement centuries after the inhabitants left. This persistence demonstrates how planning can outlast population, memory, and political systems. Timgad challenges the idea that ancient cities evolved primarily through organic growth, showing instead how centralized design could shape social behavior. The grid structured daily routines, regulated interaction, and reinforced hierarchy through predictable spatial arrangement. It shaped where people gathered, traded, worshipped, and rested. At the same time, it offered residents a sense of stability and familiarity within an empire spanning thousands of kilometers. Timgad functioned as a fragment of Rome transplanted into Africa, reproducing imperial identity through streets rather than soldiers alone. Yet the city also adapted to local conditions, integrating North African traditions, materials, and social practices into its Roman framework. This hybrid character reflects the flexibility underlying Roman expansion. As sand continues to drift across abandoned avenues and sunlight traces patterns along stone pavements, the grid remains visible, persistent, and functional. It stands as a reminder that cities are not only built from buildings, but from decisions about space. Timgad's streets embody an ancient belief that order could be engineered. that society could be stabilized through geometry. And in their quiet endurance, they reveal how ideas about control, community, and civilization were once carved directly into the ground. Pirana Harappan layers, India. Pirana lies in the flat plains of northern India's Haryana region, near the seasonal Gagar-Hakra river system, where fields, canals, and quiet villages now cover a landscape that once supported one of the earliest experiments in urban life anywhere in the world. Beneath this ordinary surface lies a deeply layered archaeological site, revealing more than 1,000 years of continuous occupation connected to the rise and development of the Indus Valley civilization. Unlike monumental ruins that dominate their surroundings, Pirana is largely invisible from a distance, because its significance is buried vertically rather than rising outward. Its importance lies in accumulated layers of habitation, construction, abandonment, and rebuilding, stacked one above another through centuries of human presence. Excavations have revealed multiple cultural phases, beginning with early pre-Harappan farming communities and continuing through mature Harappan urban society, making Pirana one of the oldest known sites associated with this civilization. These layers show how small villages gradually transformed into organized settlements with standardized bricks, planned streets, drainage systems, and regulated housing. Each phase reflects adjustment rather than replacement, because new structures were built over older ones, preserving memory within material. This process created a vertical archive of social change, where every layer records shifting technologies, beliefs, and relationships with environment. Early levels contain simple mud brick houses, handmade pottery, and basic tools, reflecting subsistence-based communities adapting to riverine conditions. Later levels reveal baked brick construction, advanced ceramics, bead-making workshops, and sophisticated drainage, indicating growing specialization and coordination. The gradual appearance of standardized brick ratios, uniform weights, and consistent street layouts demonstrates increasing integration across distant settlements. Pirana thus provides evidence that Harappan urbanism emerged through long-term evolution rather than sudden innovation. Water management appears repeatedly across layers, reflecting ongoing concern with seasonal flooding and drought. Wells, drains, and reservoirs were modified and improved over time, showing continuous experimentation with environmental control. This sustained attention to water highlights how survival and urban growth depended on careful adaptation rather than domination. Artifacts recovered from different layers reveal changing trade patterns, including shells from coastal regions, semi-precious stones from distant mountains, and metals from Western India. These materials show that even early phases were connected to wide exchange networks. Yet local traditions remained strong, as seen in continuity of house forms, craft techniques, and spatial organization. Pirana's layered structure also records episodes of stress, including flooding, erosion, and possible climatic shifts. Some layers contain signs of rapid rebuilding or temporary abandonment, indicating periods of instability followed by recovery. Rather than collapsing permanently, the community repeatedly reorganized, reinforcing resilience as a defining characteristic. Unlike later civilizations that emphasized monumental architecture and royal display, Harappan society left few palaces or temples. Authority appears to have been distributed through planning, standardization, and shared norms rather than centralized spectacle. Pirana reflects this system clearly because its layers reveal consistency rather than radical transformation. No single phase dominates, and no ruler asserts presence through oversized monuments. Instead, continuity itself becomes the main expression of social order. The absence of dramatic destruction layers suggests that change occurred gradually rather than violently. This pattern contrasts sharply with many ancient urban centers that ended through conquest or collapse. Pirana's decline appears linked to environmental change, shifting river patterns, and reduced water availability rather than warfare. As conditions worsened, occupation slowly diminished, and people relocated to more favorable areas. The site was eventually abandoned, its buildings eroded and buried by sediment and agriculture. Yet beneath modern fields, the layered record remains intact, preserving thousands of years of human adaptation. Standing at Pirana today, one sees little more than gentle mounds and open land. Yet beneath lies one of South Asia's most important archaeological archives. It reveals how cities can grow quietly, without drama or spectacle, through accumulated practice and shared understanding. Pirana challenges popular images of ancient civilization as sudden and monumental, showing instead that complexity often develops slowly. It reminds us that progress is frequently layered, patient, and incremental. The Harappan world was not built overnight, but through countless small decisions repeated across generations. And in the silent soil of Pirana, those decisions remain preserved, stacked one above another, waiting to be read by those willing to look beneath the surface. Petra High Place of Sacrifice, Jordan. High above the rock-cut facades and narrow canyons of Petra, on a windswept ridge overlooking the ancient Nabatean city, lies a ritual space carved directly into living stone, a place where landscape, belief, and architecture were merged into a single ceremonial environment. The High Place of Sacrifice sits near the summit of Jebel Madba, accessible only by a steep path cut into sandstone, requiring time, effort, and intention to reach. And this deliberate difficulty of access was central to its meaning. Unlike temples located within urban centers, this sanctuary was placed at elevation, separating ritual activity from daily life and framing worship as a physical and symbolic ascent. The Nabateans, who flourished between the 4th century BCE and 2nd century CE, were master engineers and traders, controlling caravan routes that connected Arabia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean. Their prosperity allowed investment in monumental architecture, yet much of their spiritual life unfolded in open-air spaces rather than enclosed buildings. The High Place reflects this tradition, functioning as an exposed ritual platform shaped by carving rather than construction. At the summit, the rock has been leveled to form a courtyard-like area containing altars, basins, channels, and seating carved directly into the bedrock. 2 tall stone obelisks, known as beetles, rise from the platform, representing divine presence in abstract form rather than human imagery. This abstraction reflects Nabatean religious tradition, where deities were often symbolized through uncarved stones rather than statues. The main altar stands at the highest point of the platform, positioned to command wide views across the valley and city below. Nearby basins and drainage channels indicate that liquids, likely water, wine, or blood from animal offerings, were collected and directed carefully, reflecting structured ritual practice. These features suggest that ceremonies followed prescribed sequences rather than spontaneous behavior. Stone benches carved along the edges of the platform provided seating for priests or participants, reinforcing hierarchy and order within ritual space. Movement across the summit was guided subtly by carved steps, platforms, and depressions, shaping experience without walls or barriers. This spatial control reflects a sophisticated understanding of how architecture can regulate behavior even in open environments. The choice of location emphasizes visibility and separation, because ceremonies conducted here were both remote and public, hidden in distance yet visible from parts of the city. Smoke, movement, and sound would have carried downward, connecting ritual activity to everyday life below. This dual visibility reinforced religious authority by making sacred practice present but inaccessible. The High Place was likely used for seasonal ceremonies linked to trade cycles, agricultural rhythms, and civic identity. By gathering at elevated sanctuaries, the Nabateans linked economic prosperity to divine favor. The site also served as a space of political legitimacy, where leaders could associate themselves with sacred performance. Over time, as Roman influence increased and religious practices shifted, use of the High Place declined. New temples and urban sanctuaries gradually replaced open-air rituals, reflecting changing cultural preferences. Yet the carved platform remained, preserved by its location and integration into bedrock. Later, visitors reused paths and seating without fully understanding original rituals, layering new meanings onto ancient space. Standing on the summit today, one experiences strong contrast between exposure and enclosure, between vast sky and confined platform, between silence and distant city noise. This sensory environment was likely central to ritual experience, reinforcing awe and attentiveness. The high place challenges modern assumptions that sacred architecture requires large buildings. It demonstrates how belief can be materialized through carving, positioning, and landscape rather than mass. Here, nature itself becomes part of the structure, shaped just enough to guide human interaction. The site reveals a society that understood how to transform terrain into theology. It shows how spiritual authority was anchored in elevation, effort, and visibility. And as sunlight moves across red sandstone and winds sweep across the ridge, the high place remains as it was shaped, continuing to mark a point where human devotion once met sky, stone, and silence. Cotoche Temple of the Hands, Peru. High in the central Andes of Peru, near the modern city of Huánuco, lies the quiet archaeological site of Cotoche, where stone platforms and low walls mark the remains of one of the oldest known ceremonial traditions in South America. Surrounded by mountain slopes, shifting clouds, and thin, high-altitude air, the site feels distant from major trade routes and political centers. Yet thousands of years ago, it functioned as an important spiritual gathering place for early Andean communities. The most distinctive structure at Cotoche is known as the Temple of the Hands, a small enclosed ceremonial chamber built around 2000 BCE, long before the rise of large Andean states or empires. Unlike open plazas or towering pyramids, this temple is inward-facing, designed for limited participation rather than mass gathering. Its walls are made from carefully stacked stone and mud plaster, forming a compact square space with a central hearth. This hearth appears to have been the focus of ritual activity, used repeatedly for burning offerings, creating layers of ash and charcoal that accumulated over time. What makes the temple unique are two clay reliefs embedded into opposite walls, each depicting a pair of human hands emerging from the surface, palms facing outward. These sculpted hands are life-sized, realistic, and deliberately positioned, transforming abstract ritual space into something personal and intimate. Their placement suggests symbolic engagement between participants and the unseen forces represented by the structure. The hands may represent ancestors, deities, or ritual intermediaries, serving as visual anchors for communication between human and spiritual realms. Unlike later Andean iconography filled with complex imagery, these reliefs are minimal, emphasizing gesture rather than narrative. This simplicity suggests that meaning here was conveyed through action and presence rather than storytelling. Participants likely entered the chamber in small groups, conducted offerings at the hearth, and engaged in repetitive ceremonial routines. The enclosed design would have intensified sound, heat, and smoke, creating a sensory environment that reinforced ritual focus. Such control over atmosphere reflects deliberate architectural planning. The temple belongs to a broader tradition known as the Cotoche religious tradition, characterized by repeated rebuilding of ceremonial chambers over earlier ones. Each phase involved sealing the old chamber and constructing a new one above it, preserving sacred space through layering. This practice reflects continuity and reverence, where earlier rituals were respected rather than erased. Over centuries, multiple temples accumulated at the site, forming a vertical sequence of ceremonial spaces. This layering parallels patterns seen later in Andean cultures, suggesting long-term continuity in religious thinking. Unlike societies that invested in monumental public temples, Cotoche emphasizes intimacy and controlled participation. Authority here appears to have been exercised through ritual knowledge rather than spectacle. There is little evidence of elite residences, palaces, or military structures nearby, indicating that religious leadership operated within relatively small-scale communities. Artifacts found at the site include simple ceramics, stone tools, and organic remains, reflecting modest material culture rather than wealth accumulation. This suggests that ritual life was integrated into everyday subsistence rather than separated from it. Environmental conditions in the highlands required careful agricultural management, and ritual practice may have helped coordinate seasonal labor and social cooperation. Ceremonies likely reinforced shared identity and mutual obligation. Over time, as population shifted and new cultural traditions emerged, Kotosh's importance declined. Yet its influence persisted, because later Andean societies continued to emphasize ritual continuity, hearth-centered ceremonies, and layered sacred architecture. Standing inside the reconstructed Temple of the Hands today, one experiences a sense of closeness and quiet intensity. The space feels designed for reflection rather than display, for participation rather than observation. The sculpted hands remain the emotional core of the chamber, reaching outward across millennia. They remind us that some of humanity's earliest religious expressions focused not on gods in the sky or kings on thrones, but on gesture, connection, and shared presence. Kotosh challenges assumptions that early ritual was primitive or unsystematic. Instead, it reveals careful design, symbolic restraint, and deep attention to human experience. It shows how spiritual life could be organized around small spaces and simple forms, yet still carry lasting meaning. And as mountain winds pass over the stone platforms and clouds drift across the valley, the Temple of the Hands remains as a quiet record of how early Andean communities shaped belief through enclosure, repetition, and touch. Loyalty. Unlike temporary wooden theaters used in earlier Roman history, Sabratha's structure was built entirely from stone, designed for permanence rather than seasonal use. This decision required extensive preparation of foundations, because coastal soil is unstable, influenced by groundwater, erosion, and shifting sediment. Engineers excavated deep trenches and filled them with layered stone, mortar, and compacted earth, creating a stable platform capable of supporting multi-story masonry. These foundations were not merely technical necessities, but political investments, because building such a structure signaled long-term commitment to the city's future. The theater's semicircular seating area, or cavea, was arranged in precisely calculated tiers, supported by substructures that distributed weight evenly. Beneath these seating rows lay corridors, staircases, and vaulted passages that allowed controlled movement of spectators. These internal systems were embedded directly into the foundation level, revealing how circulation was planned from the ground up. The stage building, or skane fronts, rose in 3 levels of columns, niches, and statues, forming an elaborate backdrop for performances. Its weight required especially strong foundations, reinforced with thick stone blocks and buttressing walls. This massive substructure ensured that decorative elements remained stable despite coastal weather and seismic activity. The placement of the theater near the shoreline was symbolic as well as practical, connecting urban life to maritime trade and emphasizing Sabratha's role within Mediterranean networks. Performances here were not only entertainment, but tools of cultural integration, reinforcing Roman language, values, and social hierarchy. The theater hosted dramas, speeches, and ceremonies that transformed architectural space into political theater. Seating arrangements reflected social status, with elites positioned closest to the stage and ordinary citizens placed farther back. These hierarchies were physically encoded into the structure itself, turning architecture into a system of social ordering. The foundation supported not only stone and spectators, but patterns of behavior and authority. Over time, as Roman control weakened and trade declined, Sabratha's population decreased. Maintenance of large public buildings became difficult, and sections of the theater fell into disrepair. Later occupations reused parts of the structure for housing, storage, and defense, altering original circulation systems and blocking some passages. Earthquakes and coastal erosion further damaged foundations, causing collapses and deformation. Yet much of the substructure survived, preserving the underlying logic of Roman engineering. Modern restoration efforts rebuilt portions of the theater, using surviving foundations as guides. These reconstructions reveal how precisely the original builders calculated load, spacing, and balance. Standing in the theater today, one can see how performance depended on invisible infrastructure. The spectacle above relied entirely on stability below. Sound projection, crowd movement, and visual framing were all made possible by carefully engineered groundwork. This hidden complexity reminds us that monumental architecture is rarely defined by appearance alone. Its true achievement lies in what remains unseen. Sabratha's theatre foundations demonstrate how Roman power operated through durability, planning, and standardization. They show how empire translated ideology into stone, embedding civic order into physical systems. Yet, despite imperial ambition, the structure ultimately depended on local labor, materials, and maintenance. Its survival reflects cooperation between central authority and regional society. As waves continue to strike the shoreline and sunlight moves across ruined columns, the foundations remain where they were laid, still, supporting fragments of a vanished world. They preserve the memory of voices, movements, and rituals that once filled this space. And in their quiet endurance, they remind us that every great performance rests upon structures built patiently, carefully, and out of sight. Karla Cave, Chaitya Hall, India. High in the rocky hills of western India's Sahyadri range, near ancient trade routes that once connected the Deccan Plateau to the Arabian Sea, the Karla Caves are carved into dark basalt cliffs, forming one of the most refined and enduring examples of early Buddhist architecture in South Asia. Among these caves, the Chaitya Hall at Karla stands apart for its scale, precision, and atmosphere, representing the peak of rock-cut religious design between the 1st century BCE and the 2nd century CE. Unlike temples built from assembled stone blocks, this structure was created entirely through subtraction, carved inward from solid rock, requiring long-term planning and disciplined labor. Every column, beam, and decorative element was shaped by removing material rather than stacking it, meaning that mistakes could not be reversed. The hall measures more than 40 meters in length, making it one of the largest early Buddhist prayer halls in India, yet its interior feels balanced and intimate rather than overwhelming. A long central nave runs from entrance to shrine, flanked by rows of carefully carved columns that guide movement and sightlines. These columns imitate wooden architecture, complete with carved ribs, brackets, and beam patterns, preserving forms from earlier timber traditions that have otherwise vanished. This imitation reveals continuity between temporary and permanent building methods, showing how religious communities translated familiar materials into lasting stone. At the far end of the hall stands a large stupa, the symbolic focus of worship, representing the presence of the Buddha through form rather than imagery. Devotees would walk slowly around this stupa in ritual circumambulation, following prescribed paths shaped by architectural design. This movement reinforced meditation, discipline, and collective rhythm. Above, the ceiling is carved with ribbed vaulting that enhances acoustics, allowing chants and prayers to resonate softly throughout the space. Natural light enters through a large horseshoe-shaped window above the entrance, illuminating the stupa and central aisle while leaving side spaces in shadow. This controlled lighting creates a gradual transition from brightness to stillness, reinforcing spiritual focus. Inscriptions on columns and walls record donations from merchants, guilds, and individuals, revealing that construction was funded through collective patronage rather than royal command. Many donors were traders who traveled these mountain routes, linking religious life to commercial networks. This connection reflects how Buddhism spread through movement, exchange, and shared support, rather than political imposition. The surrounding cave complex includes monasteries, living quarters, and auxiliary shrines, forming a self-contained religious community. Monks lived, studied, and practiced here, supported by donations and seasonal visitors. The location, near major trade corridors, ensured steady interaction with diverse populations. Over centuries, Karla remained active, adapting to changing artistic styles and religious practices without losing its core identity. Later caves added decorative elements, yet the Chaitya Hall retained its original simplicity and authority. When Buddhist institutions declined in parts of India, activity here gradually diminished, but the structure itself remained intact, protected by its integration into solid rock. Unlike freestanding temples vulnerable to collapse and reuse, Karla's architecture endured through geological stability. Standing inside the hall today, one experiences an immediate sense of calm and spatial coherence. Sound softens, movement slows, and attention narrows naturally toward the stupa. This effect is not accidental, but the result of careful proportion, lighting, and circulation design. The hall functions as an instrument for meditation, shaping mental states through physical form. Carla challenges the idea that monumental architecture requires mass or height. It shows how depth, enclosure, and rhythm can produce equally powerful presence. It reveals how spiritual authority can be embedded in geometry, repetition, and restraint. The site also reflects early Buddhist values of simplicity, discipline, and communal support. There is no emphasis on royal display or personal glorification. Instead, meaning arises from shared practice and collective memory. The Chaitya Hall stands as a bridge between impermanent traditions and lasting form. It preserves wooden architecture in stone, oral ritual in spatial design, and social cooperation in physical structure. And as sunlight filters through the ancient window and dust drifts across carved columns, the hall continues to perform its original function, offering a space where silence, movement, and belief remain carefully balanced. Pacame, Adobe Walls, Mexico. In the wide desert valleys of northern Mexico's Chihuahua region, where mountains rise in the distance and rivers appear only seasonally, the ruins of Pacame stand quietly among open fields and dry air, preserving the remains of one of the most complex pre-Columbian cities in North America. Also known as Casas Grandes, Pacame flourished between the 13th and 15th centuries CE, functioning as a major cultural and trade center that linked Mesoamerica with the American Southwest. Unlike stone-built cities of central Mexico, Pacame was constructed primarily from adobe, sun-dried mud bricks shaped by hand and layered into massive walls that once supported multi-story buildings. These adobe walls formed dense clusters of rooms, courtyards, and passageways, creating an urban environment that emphasized enclosure, temperature control, and internal organization. At its peak, Pacame may have contained more than 2,000 rooms, arranged in connected blocks rather than isolated houses. This dense layout reflects coordinated planning rather than spontaneous growth, indicating centralized authority and shared construction standards. The thickness of the adobe walls provided insulation against extreme desert temperatures, keeping interiors cool during the day and warm at night. This environmental adaptation was essential for sustaining large populations in a harsh climate. Water management played a central role in Pacame's development. An extensive network of canals, reservoirs, and drains directed river water through the city, supporting agriculture, domestic use, and ceremonial activity. These systems were integrated into the architecture, demonstrating holistic planning rather than isolated engineering. Within the walls, archaeologists have identified ball courts, ceremonial mounds, workshops, and specialized areas for macabre reading and copperworking. These features reveal economic and ritual complexity, rarely associated with northern Mexican societies. The presence of tropical birds and imported materials indicates long-distance trade connections extending deep into Mesoamerica. Pacame thus functioned as a northern gateway for cultural exchange, transmitting ideas, goods, and practices across ecological zones. The adobe architecture reflects both local tradition and external influence, combining southwestern building techniques with Mesoamerican spatial concepts. Rooms were stacked vertically, connected by ladders and terraces, creating layered living environments. Movement through the city was carefully regulated by walls, narrow corridors, and internal courtyards. This spatial control suggests social organization and administrative oversight rather than informal community structure. Yet despite this complexity, there is little evidence of palaces or royal tombs, indicating that authority may have been distributed among religious, commercial, and political leaders. The city appears to have operated through institutional coordination rather than personal rule. Pacame's decline around the 15th century remains debated. Possible causes include drought, resource depletion, social conflict, and disruption of trade networks. Archaeological evidence suggests episodes of burning and abandonment, indicating stress and instability. Rather than gradual fading, the city seems to have experienced a rapid breakdown followed by dispersal of its population. After abandonment, adobe walls eroded slowly under wind and rain, returning much of the city to earth. Yet enough remains to reveal original scale and organization. Standing among the ruins today, one can trace room outlines, doorways, and circulation paths, reconstructing daily life through spatial patterns. The walls continue to shape movement, guiding visitors through former neighborhoods and activity zones. Pakime challenges assumptions that large, complex cities were confined to central Mexico. It demonstrates that advanced urban planning emerged independently in multiple regions. The site reveals how societies adapted architecture, trade, and water management to marginal environments. It also shows how fragile such systems could be when ecological balance was disrupted. Pakime's adobe walls embody both innovation and vulnerability. They represent a moment when cooperation, engineering, and cultural exchange produced a thriving desert city. And as sunlight softens the contours of earthen ruins and wind carries dust across abandoned courtyards, the walls remain as quiet evidence of how people once transformed clay, water, and collective effort into enduring urban life. Knap of Howard Stone Houses, Scotland. On the wind-swept island of Papa Westre in Scotland's Orkney archipelago, where the North Atlantic meets low cliffs and open grassland, stand two small stone buildings that represent some of the oldest preserved houses in Northern Europe. Known as the Knap of Howard, these structures were built more than 5,000 years ago, during the Neolithic period. And despite their modest size, they offer rare insight into how early farming communities organized domestic life in harsh coastal environments. Unlike monumental tombs or ceremonial circles, the Knap of Howard consists of two connected houses, built close to the shoreline and partially sheltered by surrounding terrain. Their location reflects practical awareness of wind direction, drainage, and access to marine resources. The houses were constructed from local stone slabs, stacked carefully without mortar, forming thick walls that provided insulation and structural stability. This method allowed buildings to withstand strong winds, salt spray, and long winters. Each house contains a central living space surrounded by stone-built furniture, including beds, shelves, storage boxes, and hearths, all carved directly into the architecture. This integration of furnishing and structure reflects long-term planning rather than temporary habitation. The hearths occupy central positions, emphasizing fire as the core of domestic life. Around them, daily activities such as cooking, tool making, and social interaction would have unfolded within a compact, protected space. The entrances are low and narrow, forcing occupants to crouch when entering. This design minimized heat loss and limited exposure to cold winds. Light entered through small openings and doorways, creating dim but stable interior environments. Despite their simplicity, the houses display careful spatial organization. Sleeping, storage, and working areas were clearly defined within a single room. This separation suggests emerging concepts of privacy, order, and routine. Archaeological finds include pottery, stone tools, bone implements, and food remains, indicating mixed subsistence based on farming, fishing, and foraging. Residents cultivated crops, raised livestock, and harvested marine resources, balancing multiple food sources to survive unpredictable conditions. The two houses were not built simultaneously. One appears to be slightly older, with the second added later, reflecting gradual expansion rather than sudden settlement. This pattern suggests family continuity across generations. Rather than relocating frequently, inhabitants invested in maintaining and improving permanent dwellings. The surrounding landscape contains additional Neolithic sites, indicating that Knap of Howard was part of a wider settlement network rather than an isolated homestead. Orkney functioned as an important cultural center during this period, linking domestic, ritual, and communal architecture. Unlike later fortified settlements, the Knap of Howard shows no evidence of defensive features. Its design emphasizes comfort, stability, and integration with environment rather than protection from conflict. This absence suggests relatively cooperative social conditions. Over time, rising sea levels, climate change, and shifting settlement patterns led to abandonment. Sand and soil gradually buried parts of the structures, preserving them beneath protective layers. When excavated in the 20th century, the houses emerged with remarkable clarity, retaining walls, furniture, and floor layouts. Walking inside today, one experiences the intimacy of early domestic space. The low ceilings, thick walls, and enclosed rooms create a sense of closeness and continuity. It becomes easy to imagine daily routines unfolding slowly around fire and stone. The houses reveal that early European farmers did not live in crude shelters, but in carefully designed homes adapted to long-term use. They invested in comfort, organization, and durability. Knapp of Howard challenges stereotypes of prehistoric life as unstable or temporary. It shows that settled domestic traditions emerged early, grounded in planning and environmental understanding. These houses also reflect how architecture can express values without decoration. There are no carvings, monuments, or inscriptions here. Meaning is embedded in proportion, placement, and repetition. The buildings speak through function rather than display. They demonstrate that permanence can be achieved through modest materials and collective knowledge. And as Atlantic winds continue to move across the cliffs and waves strike nearby shores, the stone houses remain where they were built, preserving a quiet record of how ordinary families once shaped stable lives at the edge of the ancient world. Qumran ruins. Dead Sea. On the barren western shore of the Dead Sea, where salt flats shimmer under intense sunlight and rocky hills descend sharply into mineral-rich water, the ruins of Qumran rest in near silence, surrounded by one of the harshest landscapes in the Middle East. Rain is rare here, vegetation is sparse, and summer heat is relentless. Yet more than 2,000 years ago, a small community chose this isolated place to build a permanent settlement shaped by discipline, ritual, and withdrawal from the wider world. Qumran flourished mainly between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE, during a period of political tension and religious transformation in Judea. It is best known today for its association with the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient manuscripts discovered in nearby caves that preserve some of the earliest known biblical and sectarian texts. Yet beyond the manuscripts, the physical remains of Qumran reveal how belief was translated into daily structure and architectural form. The settlement consists of modest stone buildings arranged around courtyards, workshops, storage rooms, and communal spaces. There are no palaces, no monumental temples, and no elaborate decorations. Instead, the architecture emphasizes simplicity, regularity, and shared use. One of Qumran's most distinctive features is its extensive system of water channels, cisterns, and stepped pools. These installations collected rare rainfall and flash floodwater from nearby hills, directing it into large reservoirs and ritual baths. Managing water in this environment required precise engineering and constant maintenance. The stepped pools, often identified as mikvaot, were likely used for ritual purification, reflecting strict religious regulations governing daily life. Their number and scale suggest that ritual cleanliness was central rather than secondary. This infrastructure transformed scarcity into structure, making water both a practical and spiritual resource. Rooms interpreted as scriptoria, dining halls, and assembly spaces indicate that much of life here was communal. Meals, study, and prayer were likely conducted collectively rather than privately. Storage jars found on site suggest centralized food management and shared distribution. Such organization reflects a community oriented toward equality, discipline, and collective responsibility. Many scholars associate Qumran with the Essenes, a Jewish sect known for ascetic practices and separation from mainstream society, though this identification remains debated. Regardless of precise affiliation, the settlement reflects deliberate withdrawal from urban centers and political authority. Its location near cliffs and caves provided both isolation and refuge, reinforcing separation from external influence. Caves in the surrounding hills were used for storage, shelter, and manuscript preservation. These natural spaces became extensions of the settlement, integrating landscape into religious practice. The decision to hide texts rather than display them suggests concern with preservation over publicity. This focus on continuity reflects a worldview oriented toward future generations rather than immediate recognition. Qumran's layout reveals careful regulation of movement. Paths, doorways, and open spaces guided daily routines, reducing unpredictability. Architecture here functioned as a behavioral framework, shaping conduct through environment rather than enforcement. During the Roman campaign in Judea in the 1st century CE, the settlement was damaged and eventually abandoned. Some buildings show signs of fire and destruction, while others were simply left unused. The community appears to have dispersed, taking refuge elsewhere or merging into broader society. The scrolls were hidden in caves, sealed in jars, and left behind. Their preservation transformed Qumran from an obscure desert site into one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Yet even without the manuscripts, the ruins reveal a society that prioritized order, restraint, and shared purpose. Standing among the remains today, one senses the intentional simplicity of the place. There is little to distract the eye and little to impress through scale. Instead, the settlement encourages stillness and attention. The harsh environment reinforces this effect, limiting comfort and emphasizing self-discipline. Qumran challenges assumptions that ancient communities sought prosperity and expansion. It shows that some groups valued withdrawal, regulation, and moral clarity over wealth and influence. They invested in infrastructure not to grow, but to preserve a way of life. The ruins demonstrate how belief can reshape even the most difficult landscapes into functional social systems. They reveal how architecture can embody ethical principles. And as the Dead Sea continues to recede and desert, winds move. Across abandoned courtyards, Qumran remains as a quiet record of how conviction, cooperation, and restraint once transformed isolation into enduring community.